At the far southwestern edge of Santa Barbara County, where the coastline bends hard and the cliffs drop straight into cold water, there is a headland, the Chumash, called Humqaq. The Spanish renamed it Point Conception. Sailors have feared the crossing there for centuries because two ocean currents collide at that exact spot, and the water turns unpredictable within a few hundred feet of otherwise calm sea. In Chumash cosmology, Humqaq was not simply dangerous water. It was the Western Gate, the place where the spirits of the dead left the mainland behind and crossed into the next world. Sometime in the final years of the 1890s, a rancher working land near that headland began writing down conversations he had with a Chumash elder who still lived close to the old mission grounds. What he recorded, in notebooks that would not surface again for decades, described something more specific than a spirit crossing. She spoke of a village. She spoke of ground that people had once walked on, fished from, and buried their dead in, now lying somewhere beneath the channel that separates the mainland from the islands. The land, she told him, had not always ended where it ends today. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The notebooks are not an official record. No agency filed them, no journal published them, and the rancher who kept them had no ethnographic training. What survives of his account is best treated the way most testimony from that period has to be treated, as a plausible reconstruction of what was likely said, offered without a certified original to check it against. But the shape of what he wrote down was not invented from nothing. It corresponds, in specific and unusual ways, to material gathered independently from Chumash consultants a generation later, by researchers working under an entirely different institutional structure and a different method entirely. And it corresponds, more strikingly, to a body of geological evidence that no one in 1890, rancher or scientist, had any way of accessing. That convergence is the reason this account is worth following, past the point where most regional folklore gets quietly filed away and forgotten. To understand what was lost before any of this could be properly investigated, it helps to understand what the Chumash world looked like before the missions arrived. Along the coast that now runs from San Luis Obispo down through Santa Barbara and Ventura, and out across the four northern Channel Islands, the Chumash had built one of the densest and most maritime societies in pre-contact North America. Population estimates for the region before Spanish contact range between 15,000 and 22,000 people, spread across dozens of permanent villages, some of them larger than any European settlement on the continent at the time. They were not a foraging people living at the margins. They built plank canoes called tommels, sewn together from redwood planks that had drifted down the coast on ocean currents, caulked with a natural asphalt called yop that seeped up from underwater seeps in the Santa Barbara Channel itself. A tommel could carry a crew and cargo across open water to the islands in a single day, in conditions that would capsize a rowboat. That maritime skill was not incidental to Chumash life. It was the foundation of a trade economy that moved shell bead currency, soapstone from the islands, and food surplus up and down the coast, in a network that had been running, by the archaeological evidence, for thousands of years before any written record existed. The asphalt itself came from natural seeps on the channel floor, the same geological feature that produces the tar seeps at Carpinteria, and further inland, the La Brea tar pits, and Chumash divers and shoreline gatherers had learned to work with it as a caulking material long before any of that seepage had a name in a scientific paper. Beads cut from the shell of the purple olive snail, ground down and drilled by specialists on the islands, functioned as a standardized currency across the entire region, exchanged for mainland acorns, obsidian, and deer meat in quantities precise enough that later archaeologists have been able to reconstruct rough exchange rates from the bead counts left in burial sites. Then came the missions. Mission La Purísima was founded in 1787. Mission Santa Barbara followed 2 years later. Mission Santa Ynez came in 1804. Within a single human lifetime, the Chumash population collapsed by a figure historians now estimate at somewhere close to 90%, driven by introduced disease, forced relocation into mission compounds, and the systematic disruption of the village and marriage networks that had sustained Chumash society for centuries. Village sites that had been continuously occupied for thousands of years emptied within a generation. Languages that had distinct dialects for nearly every stretch of coastline began losing fluent speakers by the 1850s. By the time the United States conducted its first serious ethnographic surveys of California in the final decades of the 19th century, the number of people who could speak fluently about pre-mission Chumash cosmology, geography, and oral history had shrunk to a small handful of elders, most of them elderly, most of them living on land that no longer belonged to their families. The knowledge that survived did not survive passively. In 1824, Chumash neophytes at Mission Santa Ynez, Mission La Purísima, and Mission Santa Barbara rose up together in a coordinated revolt against Franciscan authority and the Mexican soldiers stationed to enforce it, seizing La Purísima outright and holding it for close to a month before Mexican troops retook it by force. The uprising is one of the best documented acts of organized native resistance in California mission history, and it mattered here for a specific reason. The people who led it, and the families who fled into the interior afterward rather than return to mission control, were the same lineages who carried forward the geographical and cosmological knowledge that later ethnographers would spend decades trying to recover second-hand. What the missions did not erase, the revolt's aftermath scattered into the mountains and the San Joaquin Valley, out of reach of the institutions that would eventually come looking for it. The earliest written record of that world comes from a source considerably older than any American ethnographer. In 1542, the Portuguese navigator Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed into the Santa Barbara Channel under the Spanish flag and recorded, in the log his crew kept, encountering a dense string of Chumash villages along the coast, some of them home to what the log described as several hundred people apiece, with canoes putting out from shore to meet the ships. That log is the first documentary confirmation, more than 2 centuries before the missions arrived, that the coastline the Chumash occupied was as populated and maritime as the archaeological record later suggested. It also means the disruption that followed did not begin with the Franciscans. Cabrillo's expedition itself introduced diseases against which the Chumash had no prior exposure, and population decline along the channel was already underway, in a smaller and less documented way, more than 200 years before Mission Santa Barbara was founded. This is the world the ranchers' notebooks come from. Not a timeless, unchanging tradition preserved in isolation, but the compressed testimony of the very last generation who had heard the older stories directly, second-hand, from people who themselves remembered a coastline before the missions reorganized it. What that elder told him about a village beneath the water did not exist in a vacuum. It existed inside a body of Chumash cosmology that had already been partially recorded and partially dismissed by the people collecting it. The clearest surviving version of the story she may have been drawing from comes from a different source entirely, gathered a generation later by the linguist John Peabody Harrington, working primarily with a Chumash consultant named Fernando Librado, also known by his Chumash name Kitsepawit. Harrington's fieldwork with Librado ran from around 1912 into the 1920s, and it produced one of the most detailed surviving records of Chumash cosmology anywhere in the historical archive. According to the origin account Librado gave Harrington, the Earth Mother, Hutash, created the first people on the island of Limuw, which is the Chumash name for what is now called Santa Cruz Island. When the island grew too crowded to support them, Hutash built a bridge across the channel to the mainland, made from a rainbow. The people crossed it in the dark, and Hutash warned them not to look down. Some did anyway. Those who looked down fell from the bridge into the churning water below, and out of compassion, Hutash transformed them into dolphins as they fell, so they would not drown. That is why, in the traditional account, the Chumash consider dolphins their relatives. Anthropologists in the 20th century classified this story as a creation myth, filed alongside comparable origin narratives from cultures around the world, and treated its geographical detail as symbolic rather than literal. A rainbow bridge across open ocean is not, on its face, a plausible physical structure, but the story is not actually claiming that a literal bridge of light once spanned the channel. What it is describing, in the language available to a culture without written geology, is a moment when the distance between Limuw and the mainland was crossable in a way it no longer is. And on that specific point, the geological record does not dismiss the story, it confirms it. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, global sea level stood approximately 390 feet lower than it does today, because so much of the planet's water was locked into continental ice sheets. At that sea level, the four northern Channel Islands, San Miguel, Santarosae, Santa Cruz, and Anacapa, were not four separate islands at all. They were joined into a single, much larger landmass that geologists now call Santarosae. And the channel separating Santarosae from the mainland, which today stretches more than 20 miles at its narrowest point near Point Mugu, was at that time closer to 4 or 5 miles across. 4 or 5 miles of open water is still a serious crossing. It is not, however, a crossing that requires a supernatural bridge to imagine. It is a crossing that a skilled maritime people with reed rafts or early plank technology could reasonably have attempted, particularly on a clear day, with the mainland visible the entire way. As the ice sheets melted and sea level rose across the following millennia, that narrow channel widened. Santarosae broke apart into the 4 separate islands that exist today. Coastal land that had been dry ground, including whatever settlements, gathering sites, or crossing points people had used to reach the islands, went underwater permanently. This was not a single flood. It was a slow, multi-thousand-year drowning of the coastline, and by most reconstructions the process was substantially complete by around 6,000 years ago, though sea level continued rising more gradually after that point. The physical evidence for how early people were living in this region during that drowning event comes from one of the most important archaeological finds in North America. In 1959, the paleontologist Phil Orr excavated human remains on Santa Rosa Island at a site called Arlington Springs. Those remains, later redated using improved radiocarbon methods by researchers including John Johnson and John Erlandson, came back at approximately 13,000 years old, making Arlington Springs Man among the oldest confirmed human remains found anywhere in the Americas. 13,000 years ago, Santarosae still existed as a single island, separated from the mainland by that narrower channel. Someone made that crossing, by boat, at a depth of technological sophistication that surprised the archaeologists who found the evidence. The rise in sea level that eventually split Santarosae into 4 islands was not smooth. Geologists have identified at least one period of dramatic acceleration, an event known as meltwater pulse 1A, roughly 14,600 years ago, when catastrophic ice sheet collapse pushed global sea level up by as much as 50 feet in a span some researchers estimate at under 500 years. A shoreline that had been stable within a human generation could have moved inland by a noticeable amount within a single elder's remembered lifetime during a pulse event like that. It is exactly the kind of geological event that a purely oral culture, watching the water reach further up the beach every few years, would have had every reason to encode into a story about a crossing that used to be shorter and a bridge that people fell from. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Arlington Springs find fits into a broader theory that has reshaped how archaeologists understand the earliest peopling of the Americas. For decades, the dominant model held that the first Americans arrived on foot, walking south through an ice-free corridor that opened between retreating glaciers somewhere in the interior of the continent. That model has been steadily challenged by a competing idea called the Kelp Highway hypothesis, developed most prominently by the archaeologist John Erlandson and his colleagues in the 2000s. The Kelp Highway hypothesis proposes that the earliest migration into the Americas moved primarily along the coast, by boat, following a nearly continuous belt of kelp forest ecosystems that ran from Northeast Asia down the Pacific Rim to South America. Kelp forests are extraordinarily productive environments, rich in fish, shellfish, and marine mammals, and a maritime people moving along that belt would have had a reliable food source at every stage of the journey, without needing to wait for an interior ice corridor to open at all. If the Kelp Highway hypothesis is correct, and the physical evidence at sites like Arlington Springs increasingly supports it, then the Santa Barbara Channel was not a peripheral outpost of early American settlement. It sat close to the center of the earliest coastal migration route on the entire Pacific coast of North America. And that raises an uncomfortable problem for the archaeological record, because a coastal migration route by definition follows the coastline, and the coastline of 13,000 years ago is not the coastline that exists today. Sea level rise since the last glacial maximum has submerged an enormous amount of the continental shelf along the California coast, in some places extending the drowned zone many miles out from the current shoreline. Whatever early settlements, camps, or crossing points existed along that ancient coast are now sitting underwater, buried under sediment, on a stretch of continental shelf that has never been systematically surveyed by archaeologists working at the depths required. This is the specific gap the ranchers' notebooks fall into, and it is worth being precise about what they claim and what they do not. They do not claim to describe Santarosae directly or the Ice Age crossing that produced Arlington Springs Man. The elder he spoke with was describing something that sounded, in his account, considerably more recent and specific: a named place, structures, a burial ground, features of a community that felt within reach of living memory, rather than deep prehistory. Read plainly, that account looks less like a folk memory of the Ice Age crossing and more like a description of a much later coastal village, closer to the historic period, that was lost to a combination of storm erosion, channel migration, and the same long-term sea level rise that has continued, more slowly, throughout the entire Holocene. The Santa Barbara Channel coastline is geologically active and erosion-prone, and archaeologists working the region have documented multiple village sites now partially or entirely underwater close to shore, sites that were occupied within the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, and abandoned as the coastline retreated around them. The elder's account may be describing one of these more recent losses, filtered through the same cosmological language that framed the older Limuw crossing story, rather than describing the Ice Age landmass itself. Either reading leaves the same basic claim standing. The Chumash oral tradition, independently and repeatedly, describes land where there is now only water, and the geological record, independently and repeatedly, confirms that such land existed. The mechanism by which this convergence went unexamined for as long as it did was not conspiracy. It was neglect, and it operated through the institutional habits of the discipline that was supposed to be paying attention. American anthropology in the final decades of the 19th century and the opening decades of the 20th was actively working to establish itself as a rigorous scientific field, distinct from the amateur antiquarianism and speculative diffusionism that had characterized earlier decades of American archaeology. Part of that professionalization involved a systematic classification of Native American oral tradition into the category of myth and folklore, a category treated as culturally significant but historically unreliable. The province of comparative mythologists rather than working scientists studying physical evidence. The University of California established its Department of Anthropology in 1901 under the direction of Alfred Kroeber, and Kroeber's California survey work, extraordinarily thorough as it was in cataloging language, material culture, and social organization across the state's native peoples, treated origin narratives primarily as cultural and linguistic data rather than as potential evidence of geological or historical events. A story about a rainbow bridge went into the same analytical bucket as a story about a trickster coyote. Neither was read as a record that a geologist might need to consult. That habit of classification was not unique to California, and it was not, in hindsight, correct. In 2016, the researchers Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed published a study examining Aboriginal Australian oral traditions that describe coastlines and islands in configurations that no longer exist, configurations that match, with striking precision, the coastline of Australia as it stood before post-glacial sea level rise more than 7,000 years ago. Their conclusion, controversial when it was first proposed and increasingly accepted since, was that certain oral traditions can preserve accurate geographical memory across spans of time that most historians had assumed were far beyond the reach of purely verbal transmission. If an oral tradition on one continent can preserve accurate detail about a coastline drowned 7,000 years ago, there is no principled reason to assume a comparable tradition on the California coast could not do the same. The dismissal of the Chumash accounts as symbolic rather than potentially descriptive was a disciplinary habit, not a finding based on testing the claim against the physical evidence. Nobody tested it, because nobody thought there was anything to test. What happened to the people who might have pushed back against that habit tells its own part of the story. The generation of Chumash elders who held the most detailed pre-mission knowledge, the generation the rancher's elder and Fernando Librado both belonged to, was dying out precisely during the decades when American anthropology was becoming systematic enough to have properly investigated their claims. Librado himself died in 1915, in the middle of his work with Harrington, before that work was fully transcribed and organized. Harrington was famously reluctant to publish his own material, obsessive about accumulating new field notes rather than finishing analysis of what he already had, and a significant portion of his Chumash notes remained unpublished and effectively inaccessible to other researchers for decades after his death in 1961, sitting in boxes at the Smithsonian rather than in print where a geologist studying the Channel Islands might have come across them. Harrington's field notes did not begin reaching researchers outside the Smithsonian in any organized way until a major cataloging project, led by the archivist Elaine Mills, began microfilming and indexing the full collection starting in the 1970s, roughly a decade after Harrington's death and close to 6 decades after his fieldwork with Librado began. For most of the 20th century, the single most detailed surviving record of the Limuw crossing story sat in boxes that almost no working geologist or coastal archaeologist had reason to open. The ranchers' notebooks fell into an even quieter kind of obscurity. They were never submitted anywhere. They were kept, as far as the surviving account of their transmission indicates, within his own family, treated as a personal curiosity rather than a piece of testimony that belonged in an institutional archive. A grandson is said to have shown a portion of the notebooks to a small regional historical society sometime in the 1970s, decades after the rancher's death, and a handful of pages were transcribed into a mimeographed local newsletter with a print run small enough that few copies survive today in any public collection. No professional archaeologist appears to have followed up on the reference at the time. By the 1970s, the discipline's attention was fixed on Harrington's papers, then just beginning to be catalogued, and a family newsletter transcription from an untrained 19th century rancher did not register as a document worth cross-checking against a body of Smithsonian field notes still sitting largely unread in Washington. What the elder is said to have told him, in the reconstructed account, centers on a specific description worth sitting with directly. She described a place where people had lived near fresh water and good fishing, close enough to the channel crossing that canoes launched from it regularly. She described the ground giving way over time, not suddenly, but across seasons and years, the way a riverbank erodes rather than the way a building collapses. And she described a specific detail that the rancher apparently found strange enough to write down without fully understanding it, that on certain calm mornings when the water was clear, people could still see shapes on the channel floor near the crossing point that did not look like natural rock formations. Whether that detail reflects something real, a trick of light on kelp-covered rock, or an embellishment added somewhere in the retelling before it reached the rancher's page, it is impossible to verify from the surviving account. The account itself has to be treated with the same caution its transmission history demands. It was written down decades after it was likely told, by a man without training in either the language or the culture he was recording, in notebooks that were not properly archived until long after his death. Nothing in it can be checked against the specific words the elder actually used. What can be checked is the underlying physical claim, and on that point, the elder's account, whatever its exact original wording, sits inside a body of testimony and evidence that keeps pointing in the same direction. That direction is confirmed today by a body of underwater archaeology that has only become methodologically possible in the last 2 decades. The Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, working with researchers including John Erlandson and Torben Rick, has spent years using multibeam sonar mapping to search the submerged continental shelf around the Channel Islands for evidence of the drowned paleocoastal landscape, looking for ancient river channels, shoreline terraces, and potential archaeological sites now sitting underwater that in some places exceeds 400 feet in depth. The work is slow, expensive, and constrained by the sheer difficulty of conducting controlled archaeological excavation underwater at those depths, and the surveyed area to date represents only a small fraction of the total submerged shelf that was once dry land during the period when Santarosae existed as a single island and the channel crossing was a fraction of its current width. The surveys completed so far have already identified several drowned river channels and stepped shoreline terraces on the shelf between the mainland and the islands, features that match the predicted ancient coastline almost exactly at the depths the sea level models forecast, which is the kind of confirmation that makes archaeologists confident enough to keep funding the slower, far more expensive work of searching those terraces for actual cultural material rather than just landforms. No confirmed submerged village site has yet been excavated in the specific area near Point Conception that the rancher's account describes. The broader claim that submerged paleocoastal sites exist somewhere on that shelf is no longer speculative. It is the working assumption of the researchers currently mapping it, built on the same sea level data that makes sense of the Limuw crossing story, and on the same physical reality that put a 13,000-year-old skeleton on what is now an island that used to be part of something larger. The Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary itself was established in 1980, created initially to protect the marine environment around the islands rather than to search for submerged human history, and the archaeological survey work layered onto it in the decades since has depended heavily on sonar and sub-bottom acoustic profiling equipment that did not exist in any form a coastal research budget could afford until well into the 1990s. The technology needed to even begin looking for what the rancher's elder described was, for most of the 20th century, simply unavailable at any price. Point Conception is not open to casual public access today. Much of the surrounding land remains privately held ranch property, and the lighthouse that now marks the headland sits on land the Chumash still regard as sacred, still called by its old name at ceremonies held by the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians, the only federally recognized Chumash tribal government today. The channel beyond it, the stretch of water where Santarosae once stood as a single landmass, reachable in a shorter crossing than the one that separates the mainland from Santa Cruz Island now, remains largely unmapped at the resolution that would be needed to find whatever the elder was describing to a rancher taking notes in the last years of the 1800s. The Rainbow Bridge in the Limuw origin story and the eroding village in the rancher's account may not be describing the same event at all. They may be 2 separate memories of 2 separate losses, thousands of years apart, that both point toward the same channel, the same current-torn water, and the same basic fact the geological record has since confirmed independently. The coastline the Chumash live beside today is not the coastline their ancestors were born on. The Wishtoyo Chumash Foundation, a tribal, cultural and environmental organization active along this stretch of coast today, has spent years working to keep Humqaq itself protected from further development, treating the headland less as a historical curiosity than as a place still actively in use, still spoken of in the present tense at ceremonies that have nothing to do with archaeology and everything to do with a relationship to the land that never actually stopped. That distinction matters here. The submerged village, if it is ever found, will be found using sonar, sediment cores, and a research budget. The story of its loss was never actually missing in the way the word suggests. It was sitting in plain view the entire time, carried forward by people the scientific institutions spent a century treating as sources of folklore rather than sources of evidence. Some of it is still down there, past the reach of the light, past Humqaq, in water that has kept its own record for longer than any archive on land has managed to. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.